You're listening to a 58 Ember production.
Girlscamp, it's Girlscamp.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Girlscamp podcast. I'm your host, Haley Rawl, and if you are navigating a faith deconstruction too, or simply fascinated by faith deconstruction journeys, by Mormonism specifically and religion generally, then you are in the right place. That is going to be the last time that I give that intro spiel at the beginning of the podcast because I have an announcement. And it feels like a really big deal, at least to me. It is something that I have been planning for and preparing for and thinking about for over 6 months now. And I'm equal parts excited and happy to be talking about this and also feeling nervous and sad, and we're going to get into all of it. I also wanted to mention that it just so happens to be the 2-year anniversary of Girlscamp, which is so crazy. And it also feels relevant and special that it's January, it's a fresh slate, a new year, new beginnings, that sort of thing, because the announcement is that I am going to be shifting the podcast away from focusing primarily on post-Mormonism. And today I'm going to talk about how I came to that conclusion, why I'm doing that, and what's next. There's actually a pretty specific moment that I made this decision. Like I said, it was about 6 months ago, and I was beefing with an active Mormon on TikTok. Tale as old as time. Haley beefing with an active Mormon on TikTok. We had been going back and forth that day, and I got in bed that night, and I just started sobbing, and I said to Bentley, I don't know how much longer I want to do this. And by this, I meant focusing so heavily on Mormonism and ex-Mormonism. I was realizing kind of two things simultaneously. The first one being that it's a very emotionally taxing subject matter, which has always been worth it to me. I feel like I've had so much passion and excitement and so many things to say that even though it had been somewhat emotionally taxing kind of the whole way through, in some ways, not in all of the ways, it still felt worth it. But I was also realizing that I feel like I personally was ready to move on, that I had come to a phase in my own journey of deconstruction where if I wasn't doing the Girlscamp podcast, I probably wouldn't be focusing so much on or talking so much about Mormonism. And that little TikTok beef I was talking about, the active Mormon woman actually made a video about me, and she was saying some things about me, and there were lots of comments. And there was the comment that is the most typical comment. It's something that I've gotten since I started this podcast, where people were saying, why can't she just move on? Why is she so obsessed with talking about Mormonism? And we've talked at length about why that's a crazy and stupid, quite frankly, thing to say. I still think it is. And I don't think that that was true. It never has been. It never will be. But reading those comments, it struck this little piece of my soul that made me realize that I personally, again, was starting to feel ready to move on, to move into different topics and subjects. With that realization came a lot of sadness. And I think the primary sadness that I was feeling that night was I was thinking about all the people who are in the phase of faith deconstruction that I was in 2 years ago when I started the podcast, when I had so much still to unpack and I had so much to think about and talk about and stories that I wanted to tell and stories that I wanted to hear. I just so badly didn't and still don't want to send a message that it's cool to move on from Mormonism or that there's any sort of right way at all to do any of this. I think that all of our journeys are so unique, and there's a lot of creators who have been talking about Mormonism for a really long time, and I think that that's a really, really good thing. And I think that we need people in this space who have that expertise and who have that experience. And I'm just saying that I'm not trying to put forward this idea that, yeah, you care a lot about Mormonism and then you move on. Because I also don't feel like I've moved on from Mormonism at all. I just think that for so much of the podcast, talking about all of this was really therapeutic and cathartic and helpful. And it was starting a little bit sometimes to feel like it was more so dredging up things that I had kind of already processed and moved past. And I didn't want to get stuck doing that. And when I was telling all of this to Bentley, bless his heart, he just said, yeah, Haley, I never imagined that you would talk about Mormonism forever. I always thought that you would probably at some point want to talk about something else. And having him say that was such a comfort and a gift to me in that moment, because on top of all of the personal stuff too, there's also a business element to all of this where I've built a platform on a particular niche, and I don't know what this shift away from that niche is going to mean for the business side of all of these things. But just to have Bentley not even worried about that or thinking about that, just there to say, basically, Haley, you need to talk about what you want to talk about and what is authentic to you and aligned with where you're at personally, meant so much to me. And it was really just in that moment, up until that point, I'm not kidding, up until that night when I don't know what happened when I sat down in bed, I wasn't planning on not talking about Mormonism for quite a while. Like I was imagining, I hadn't mapped it out, but I was thinking a year or two at least, I still had to give and I still had things to say. And I still do have things to say, which we'll talk about a little later. But all of a sudden, I just realized like, no, I got to start thinking about that next move. I decided to give myself a lot of runway to figure out what I was going to talk about next. I also tried my best. I did call my mom immediately because it wasn't immediately. I think I called my mom the next day, but I really tried my best not to share that information with everyone I know, as is my tendency to do. I just took some time to really sit with that decision personally and to make peace with it and to think about what was next before I opened myself up to opinions even from my friends or my family. Having that long runway gave me a good amount of time to not just knee-jerk reaction into like the next thing, but to really kind of let time tell me what was next and to really just pay attention and observe the things I was thinking about and the things I was interested in. And that was also really helpful in figuring out the next phase of Girlscamp. I was kind of hoping that something would come to me really clearly and all at once, but it was actually slowly over time, piece by piece, that I basically realized that I have deconstructed down to the very bone. I not only deconstructed Mormonism, I also deconstructed Christianity, and then I deconstructed God. And then when my dad died last December, which was a huge, huge milestone in my deconstruction journey, it was almost like all of that deconstruction shit hit the fan. So I deconstructed, and then I was faced with death, which kind of throws into relief the meaning of life and the purpose of existence. Why are we here? What are we doing? It was almost like I went all the way back to square one. And then I was faced with this thing that was like, okay, you're at square one. You say you don't believe in anything, but now you're faced with death. And that's a difficult thing to reckon with when you are so deconstructed. And last year, I think, was very different for me and the types of things that I was thinking about and wondering about that were heavy on my mind and on my heart. And I've talked about this on the podcast too, but I found myself feeling pretty nihilistic at times and very bleak, feeling kind of a sense of meaninglessness and purposelessness around life. And obviously, I still think that there's meaning to just living the day-to-day life, and we'll be talking about that a lot. And as I was piecing all of that together, I thought, I think it's time to reconstruct. And even saying that makes me really happy and really excited, because we are going to be now steering the ship away from deconstruction and toward reconstruction. We're going to be rebuilding, rediscovering, exploring meaning again, and finding meaning again. My new little intro spiel, if you want to hear it, I'm still finessing it, but it's going to go something like, if you are looking for meaning again after a faith deconstruction, a loss, or a life change, simple or significant, or if you're simply fascinated in the meaning-making journey, then you are in the right place. So that kind of gives you, in a nutshell, what I'm hoping to do next on the podcast. And it's a little bit loose, and I'm keeping it intentionally loose, because another thing about 2025, an in of 2025, is not putting yourself in a box or a niche. Being nicheless in 2025 is really sexy, at least for me. So I'm excited to have a new direction, but also to not have something so constricting, and kind of see where things go, see what I like talking about, to see what you enjoy listening to, but with a general direction of, let's fill in some of these gaps that deconstruction has left. Let's try and find ways to live in alignment and to live in connection with ourselves and with others, and find meaning again. And I want to be so clear from the get-go that I am not searching for the one true truth. Like Joseph Smith, I am not out trying to find the one true thing. I think, at least for me, that's a risky road to go down. I am more so wanting to lean into exploring those things and hopefully picking up tools and practices and meanings and truths along the way that feel right to me. And then hopefully you listening can do the same. And the thing is, that's kind of ironic about all of this, is there was a certain safety in talking about ex-Mormonism, because ex-Mormonism has a certain level of sameness. I knew at least most people, a majority of people listening, could probably agree that Mormonism was wrong and somewhat too highly problematic. And there's safety in that, because I know that when I'm talking about where and how Mormonism is wrong, most people are probably agreeing with me. And on this journey of discovering meaning again, I think many people who have deconstructed religion and faith land in very, very different places, which is beautiful and as it should be. But it definitely creates kind of a different wrestle that I feel like I'm already experiencing, where I hope to be able to stay true to myself and the things that are resonating with me, and hold the honor and respect for whatever anybody else has found, and just understanding, I guess, that it is going to look different for all of us. This might feel a little random, but bear with me. I'm going to tell you of my journey with the podcast, The Telepathy Tapes. For those who have not heard of it, The Telepathy Tapes is a podcast by Kai Dickens, and she is out to prove the premise, which is that nonverbal autistic people can communicate telepathically. When I first heard about this podcast, I was very skeptical, but I decided to give it a shot. I listened to the first 5 episodes and I was converted. I was so carried away and drawn into and compelled by this story. It actually felt really life-changing, because this person was seemingly proving that telepathy is real through science, through scientific method, like actual evidence, proof. And if you can prove that telepathy is real, that opens up a whole realm of possibilities about the supernatural and about spirituality. And it was really exciting, because I felt like, oh, this is something that I'm allowed to believe in, because it's based on science, because the narrator is an admitted skeptic, and because there were none of the usual red flags that I'm kind of on the lookout for when it comes to spirituality stuff. It didn't seem like anyone stood to gain a bunch of money off of people believing this. And it made me feel really hopeful, especially around questions of death and the afterlife and the connectedness that we have. And the timing of this was really interesting because as I was listening to this podcast, this was about a month ago, I think, I was very much in the planning phase of what I was going to talk about next on Girlscamp. So I was thinking, oh, what a beautiful kind of new possibility this opens up, that now I can keep digging down this rabbit hole. There's all these spiritual things that I've been very skeptical of because they can't be proven, and now maybe they can be. And that felt like a fun place to start this journey of rediscovering my own spirituality. But then I posted about it on the internet. I made a TikTok and a reel, and I was basically just saying everything I just told you and promoting this podcast and saying how life-changing it had been for me thus far. And the primary response I got was a lot of people saying that they also really love this podcast, that it's given them a lot of hope. And so my big, fat, juicy disclaimer before the part 2 of this story is that I am not out here to debunk this podcast at all. I really don't have much skin in the game. I think it's very different. I don't want anyone to get it twisted. It's very different from Mormonism, although I'm probably going to compare it in some ways. I don't think it's the same thing. It is very different. So if that podcast, if you are into it, if it's meaningful to you, I'm so happy about that genuinely. But I'm going to tell you some of the things that I discovered that complicated things at the least. Because when I posted it, although I got a lot of people saying that they loved it and were also listening to it, I also had a handful of comments that said, this is actually really problematic and it's also very ableist. So someone on TikTok said that it was ableist, and they were like, I'd love to talk to you more if you're open to it about why that is. So I started DMing her, and she was so kind and generous with her time in kind of explaining some more things about the podcast that I hadn't caught. And then also sending me an article that was really helpful in just pointing out some red flags, I now think, in the podcast. The gist of the article, I will link it. I think recently was like an article in the Times that was kind of to the same tune. So I will link these articles. I don't agree with everything said in them wholesale. I think there's some things said that are actually a little reductive as well, but I will link them if you're curious and want to go down that rabbit hole. But the gist of the arguments against this podcast are that there is a lack of scientific rigor in the experiments that are talked about in the telepathy tapes. That comes down to, in most instances, the use of facilitated communication, which is a way of communicating that some nonverbal autistic people use, where they are communicating through a letterboard or some sort of similar device, but their communication is being facilitated either by someone holding the letterboard or touching them on the arm or on the head or something like that. And facilitated communication has a very controversial past. That's also interesting if you want to look into it. But basically, scientifically speaking, it is never going to be a scientifically sound experiment if there is facilitated communication, because the person facilitating the communication could potentially be cueing the other person as to what to say. And in many of the experiments that were set up by Kai Dickens, the telepathic communication was apparently happening between two individuals, one of whom was facilitating the communication for the nonverbal autistic individual, which wasn't very clear to me personally in listening to the podcast. Kai Dickens' argument is actually really interesting and I think worth mentioning here. She believes that it is actually ableist to say that facilitated communication should be discounted, because if nonverbal autistic individuals, if that is their only way to communicate, then to say, oh, we can't take that communication at face value because it's facilitated is diminishing, and that could be problematic, which I can see where she's coming from. But the more you dig into facilitated communication, I do think that it has been at least problematic in the past. The other thing the criticisms of the podcast mention is that sharing messages like this, that nonverbal autistic individuals can communicate telepathically, it can lead parents and teachers to have a false hope and also to maybe utilize less evidence-based therapies. Another thing that the woman who I was talking about this with on TikTok pointed out, and she's also autistic herself, so she's part of that community, although she's not nonverbal, but she was saying it can also be very exploitative to people who are autistic to say that they have supernatural abilities because it can diminish their actual lived experience, and also to be saying, oh, this group of people has these supernatural abilities, and now I, who am not in that group of people, believe in spirituality and believe all of these things based on these claims that can be exploitative as well. I have also been DMing about this podcast with a mother of a nonverbal autistic child, and she has been telling me how much she loves this podcast, how seen she feels by it, how it feels very reflective of her own experience as a mother. I just wanted to mention that too, because I really don't think that there's one prevailing opinion that has risen to the surface necessarily. And I just wanted to also let that voice be heard, because I know I saw a lot of that in the comments as well. And I personally am not connected with anyone who is autistic and nonverbal, so I can't speak to that from personal experience. But all of that to say, learning all of those red flags, if you will, really complicated the story. And I think pretty quickly for me, just kind of made me realize that it wasn't, at least to me, I don't think it was what the podcast was saying that it was. And I felt really duped and really devastated. Devastated about being duped because I've tried really, really hard to not let that happen again, because I was duped for a huge part of my life and gave a lot to that thing, i.e. Mormonism. This was very different and on a very different scale, but you get the sentiment. And I just felt frustrated that I think I had got so caught up into the hope of it all that I neglected to have the same amount of fact checking that I normally would have. But I was also feeling so devastated because I felt like, oh, of course, I find this thing that feels safe and feels sound and feels hopeful. And not only is it maybe not all of those things, but it also might come at the cost of a vulnerable group of people, right? Like, it sucked for me, of course, to be like, oh, I thought this was going to be true. But then it probably sucks even more for the group of people whom it's about if it's not entirely based on, again, sound science and logic. And that reminded me a lot of Mormonism, of feeling like I believed something and I gave a lot of my life to something that not only was harming me in a lot of ways, but was way more harmful to groups of people that were more vulnerable than I was. And for some people, it just might not be that deep. And that's okay. I have some insecurity around making things deeper and caring more about things than, I don't know, maybe I should. Not than I should, but then people think I should, which is silly. But I'm saying that because maybe for some people it's not that deep and you just found it interesting and cool and it's kind of whatever. But for me, I felt it really deeply. And I was telling Bentley, I was crying to Bentley again, which I don't think that's the last time I'm going to talk about crying to Bentley on the couch or in bed. So shout out to Bentley for letting me cry and process all of this. But I just said to Bentley, I don't feel like I'm allowed to believe in anything. It feels like there are so many landmines, and the telepathy tapes aside, I feel this way around a lot of spirituality and new age spirituality, where there are people who are looking to make money. There are people who are culturally appropriating. There's a lot of cultural appropriation in the spirituality, new age spirituality space. It just feels like such a heavy burden of skepticism that I feel forced to bear because I don't want to get duped. I don't want to get taken advantage of. And I don't want to believe in something that then I come to find out was not what I was told that it was. And it felt like all of that was happening in this tiny little lower stakes microcosm again. And it was right before I started this journey on my podcast of talking about all of those things. In retrospect, I'm actually really glad that that all happened the way it did, because I think it reminded me to have a very healthy dose of skepticism and caution. And I'm going to do my best. I think one of the not even wrestles, but one of the balances I will be trying to find throughout this next phase is being open and curious and excited about exploring and learning, while also staying rooted in sound logic and information. And that can be a very hard thing. That in and of itself is a give and take. One thing that the telepathy tapes did bring up that I was self-reflecting on was the fact that science, in certain cases, materialism especially, which is the belief that everything, even like consciousness and thinking, it all comes from something physical. So like, yes, we have thoughts in our brain, but we can prove why we have those thoughts because of the chemicals in our brain and the synapses. Is that how you say it? synapses. Does anyone else have that? I'm just kind of realizing that's what I have, where I can see a word in my mind and I know how it's spelled, but I've never actually said it out loud. Like I know what that word is, but I've never vocalized it. But you know what I'm saying? So that's materialism, and science is based on materialism. It's like, okay, what we have to be able to prove these things. And that in and of itself can kind of become like a religion, where not like you're worshiping it, but you are so dedicated to things being proven materially that maybe you are missing out on some things. And that created some interesting self-awareness for me as well. I talked to Maddie Mitchell on our episode together about astrology. I'll link that episode too. We talked about it kind of briefly, but she was basically saying, yeah, I like astrology because I like it. It's not hurting me. It's not hurting people around me. And so she's really leaned into astrology. And I think that's really fun. And I've dabbled in things like that. Astrology, palm readings. I've gotten a palm reading done that I've talked about, that I want to talk about that more actually, because that's a really interesting one, because it was really meaningful and really cool for me, even though I wouldn't say that I believe is a strong word, but I think that a lot of those spiritual practices and things, I think, are maybe rooted in something else, like perception. Certain people have gifts of perception that they can then share with others through various modalities, whether that's palm reading or tarot cards or things like that. Put a pin in that. That'll be a fun thing to talk about. But with the telepathy tapes even, I don't think that learning about all of those red flags necessarily even debunked for me that some nonverbal autistic people have this really powerful gift. I think it's probably of perception. That's kind of like my best guess right now. And I haven't really come to any specific conclusions about the telepathy tapes thing. But if you were to ask me, okay, well then what do you make of it all right now after knowing all of that? I think that certain individuals are really, really perceptive in a way that's really powerful. And rather than communicating telepathically, they're probably perceiving things really closely in a way that's really beautiful and really cool. And the bummer about the telepathy tapes is that Kai Dickens, the narrator, not only does she immediately call it telepathy, but then she sort of takes that telepathy stuff and then immediately pulls it, not immediately. It was kind of crazy reflecting back on the podcast, like how, I don't even know if this was intentional or conscious or not, but kind of how masterful the rollout of the narrative was. Because if you just told someone, hey, people can communicate telepathically, and because people can communicate telepathically, that means that there's a shared consciousness, and a shared consciousness means that there's also an afterlife. Like, those are all things that Kai Dickens ended up asserting, which all at once I would be like, okay, no. But when you are given that information slowly and through this really compelling narrative, it rings very differently. And so that was really interesting to kind of reflect on. But what I was saying is, I still think there's something really beautiful and powerful and meaningful about what Kai Dickens was exploring. I wish she just hadn't pulled it so quickly into that spiritual realm, and maybe even could have ended up there, but just had more carefulness, more care around that. And I think that sometimes these phenomenon that happen are really beautiful. And they don't need to be supernatural in order to be beautiful or in order even to be spiritual. So I guess that's a huge topic that we've got a whole podcast on which to discuss it. But for now, that's like kind of where I'm operating with the telepathy tapes stuff. And also with things like astrology, because like Maddie Mitchell said, she's like, I don't even feel the need to prove if this is true or not. I just like it, and it feels useful for me, and it feels spiritually helpful. And so she likes astrology. And I know a lot of people feel that same way too. And I think that that's great. So what's next exactly? I am keeping it loose. We're going to try some things on for size, but some of the current ideas I have are doing lots of deep dives into philosophies, spiritualities, all of that. I also am really excited to do interviews, both interviews like we've done on Girlscamp before of people's life stories. And I'm sure I'll still talk to a lot of people who have deconstructed Mormonism or other religions and just focus more on what they think and believe now, and not even believe, but like how they live their most fulfilling life now, what that looks like for them, what that means to them. And then also interviewing experts, talking to therapists, talking to people who do spiritual practices like meditation, like yoga, things like that. I want to do book and movie reviews because one of the best ways that I've filled in the gaps so far of deconstruction is by reading and watching good movies and good TV shows, because I personally learned so much about the human condition and the experience of existence by reading and watching things. And so I want to do in-depth movie reviews where we kind of break down, you know, just the usual things about shows and books, but also the meaning that is there and like kind of what they're saying about the meaning of life. I also want to keep doing submission episodes. One random idea I had on the Stairmaster this morning was doing a recurring episode where we talk about weird coincidences or glitches in the sim. I think that would be really fun. And I'm also not promising to never throw in a Mormon or religious themed topic or story submission. I will still be talking about Mormonism. Like, this is not me banning the word Mormonism from this podcast. I think that for me personally, my own journey with all of this inevitably is informed by Mormonism and will probably continue to be. And I think for a lot of people, you know, there's some people who didn't grow up with any religion at all, but a lot of people, a lot of our journey in working through all of this is in response to the religion of our upbringing. So we're still going to be talking about that. It's just not going to be as much the focus. I hinted at this earlier, I also am going to keep talking about Mormonism on the Patreon. The timing of starting that Patreon was such a godsend, universe send. It just has been such great timing because I want to keep talking about Mormonism to some extent. And the Patreon is such a good place to do it because so much of the angst I was just describing comes up for me in talking about it so publicly. And being able to do it on the Patreon, it's just a little bit more intimate and it's more community based. And so I am going to be doing Mormon content still, but on the Patreon. So if that's something that you're still looking for, It's so much fun over on the Patreon. I love it there. And we have really good discussions. So on the Patreon, at least for now, I'm going to continue talking mostly about Mormonism. I'll link that in the show notes as well. Funny enough, when I was attending Brigham Young University, the church school, I took a class called Literary Criticism with Dr. Rowan. Shout out Dr. Rowan. He's a phenomenal professor. And up until that point, I had kind of just been floating through my career, is that what you call it, at BYU? And I hadn't really connected with like anything on campus. Like I just went to class. And Dr. Rowan was such a huge part of my education because I took this class, loved it so much. I became a TA for him. So I worked for him and worked with him for a few semesters, I think. And then I ended up taking my capstone class from him as well, my very last class of my college education. And Dr. Rowan's whole philosophy about literary criticism, which is just writing about a book, or it could also be a movie or a TV show or whatever, was that a good piece of criticism is not just unpacking what the author said or what the author's intentions were, but is about finding new meaning that that piece of literature or that piece of art is exposing. And there's a lot of things that are really beautiful about that. It's just a much richer way of approaching anything, is like, what is this teaching me about the meaning of family or the meaning of forgiveness? Is that the book, The Meaning of Forgiveness? The Miracle of Forgiveness. Thank God. There's like this really terrible, terrible book called The Miracle of Forgiveness, which was written by an old Mormon prophet, Spencer W. Kimball, and it says like crazy things in there. So I thought I accidentally said that, but luckily, no, I didn't. It's taking a piece of work and seeing what it exposes about the meaning of things. And it was a really difficult learning curve to learn to write that way, but it was really fun and really mind expanding. And then because I was able to TA for that class, I just kind of got really into that way of thinking. And then when I took Dr. Rowan's capstone class, I was remembering, as I've been talking about meaning and, planning for meaning, talking about meaning on the podcast, I remembered that Dr. Rowan had given us kind of like a goodbye speech at the end of that capstone class, and it was about meaning as well. And I was like, is there any way I wrote that down? And lo and behold, I checked my notes app, and there is a note from 2019. This is not Dr. Rowan's exact words. I wish this was me jotting down, paraphrasing what he said, but I do want to read it quickly. I titled the note, Rowan Wisdom on Spiritual Meaning. And there's a little bit of irony in this that you'll catch right away. Use your English skills to not just be critical, but to do that and then find more satisfying ways of thinking about something. We can leave the church, there's the irony, or we can dig in and find newer, more satisfying answers. Satisfaction comes from creating and finding meaning rather than just inheriting and twisting the meaning people hand down. Participate in the meaning-making process. Obviously a little ironic because I did leave the church instead of finding more satisfying meanings. But I think that point still feels very poignant to me because part of this journey that I'm embarking on is not just finding meaning, but making meaning and looking at what's on offer and choosing and co-creating, I guess, meaning. And I think that's really the ultimate gift, maybe, of a faith deconstruction, is that we get to do that. I can listen to the telepathy tapes and learn some things about it and come to one conclusion, and you could do the same thing and come to a very different conclusion, and we can find and make different meanings about consciousness and spirituality and communication and humanity and all sorts of things. And I just feel like that's the exciting part of all of this, is leaning into that and not seeing it as what is the meaning of life that some philosopher in the 1900s summed up perfectly, but rather what is my meaning of life and how can that philosopher's words inform the way I live my life and the way that I make my own meaning. I think that was just kind of a funny full circle moment to think about how relevant that feels for me now, what my BYU professor said. And isn't that just sometimes how life goes? I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback and ideas, especially as I'm still figuring out exactly what this is going to look like. So please tell me what you're thinking. Tell me if any ideas come to you. Tell me if you have books that have helped you along this journey. If you have any things you want me to look into or deep dive or people you think I should talk to, I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback. And I really hope you stick around for this phase of Girls Camp. I actually have already done one interview that will come out next week, next Wednesday. And it was really interesting because it is with Shannon Ricks. She's phenomenal. She was actually recommended to me by some of you. And she's an eating disorder therapist, and she specializes in eating disorders and body image concerns. And so I was originally planning on talking to her about eating disorders and how rampant they tend to be in Mormonism and why that's the case. And instead, because I had made this shift, I knew that I was doing this episode next Wednesday and then would release that episode. The conversation we had was very different, and it was much more focused on, okay, we know that Mormonism probably fucked up our ideas of our bodies, and we talked about that a bit, like why that's the case and how, but we focused so much more on what can we do now? Like, how can we rebuild a positive body image? How can we push back against the factors in our life that are still trying to tell us that our bodies aren't good enough? It was just such a refreshing conversation to have. And even though there was part of me that was like, I just want to get into why Mormonism makes this all worse, it felt really nice to focus on, okay, regardless of that, what is ways that we can now find more peace and contentment in our own bodies. So that's just kind of an example of like the slight shift that is happening. And I hope you like it. I'm really liking it. So I hope you like it too. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sticking with me through any part of this journey that you have stuck with me through. I have been very emotional because it feels like not only a new chapter professionally in my career, it's also very much a new chapter personally for me. And that's something I'm proud of. I'm proud to be at this point in my deconstruction journey. I'm really glad, so honored. It's been one of the greatest honors of my life to be able to talk about Mormonism with you all and to hear your stories and to connect with you on that level. There's just something really, really powerful about the connection that people have who have deconstructed any faith, but Mormonism specifically. It's just something that I never, ever took for granted, and I still don't take it for granted because it made my own deconstruction so much less lonely and so much more fun, honestly. Like, even though the Mormonism topic is heavy in a lot of ways, being able to do it in this capacity and together made it fun and exciting, where if I was just doing a lot of that alone, I think it would have just been lonely and devastating. And that's all because of you. So thank you again. I can't say it enough. I'm just really glad I got to do this. I'm really glad I got started in podcasting through that. And I think that that's kind of the foundation that Girls Camp will always be built on, you know? And Bentley was also telling me, he's like, now you have this whole catalog where if anyone wants to hear about Mormon modesty culture, you have an episode on that. If people want to hear about missions, you have an episode on that. It feels really gratifying to have just this catalog of all of our stories that will always be there. Like, that's not going away. And this podcast is and always has been so participatory and will continue to be that way. So I'll just say thank you for the millionth time. Can you tell I'm dragging this out because I don't want to go? It's just crazy. It feels like a graduation in a lot of ways where it's very bittersweet. I will spare you more sentimental musings. I can't wait to see you next week for the next phase. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Talk soon. Bye.
GIRLSC
This has been a 58 Ember production. For more shows, please visit the 58 Ember channel, 58ember.com, or find us at 58 Ember Media on socials.